Okay, so I think we can start. If anybody comes a bit later, it's all right. So before we get into anything, I just have to mention that we're going to be recording this call. We're going to be recording the session, and then we will upload it to YouTube. So if anyone's is uncomfortable with that, we encourage you to leave. But if you stay, we're really happy, and we assume that you consent to the recording and your name being in there. Okay, so before we actually get into the training session, a little bit introduction from myself. My name is Gusta. I have started debating in the 9th year of my school experience, so more than 4 years of debating. Currently, I'm a first-year student, and together with Milda, my colleague, we're going to be running training sessions for you guys to get introduction to debates, but also if you just want to freshen up your memory, freshen up your skills, we're really happy to welcome you all here. And yeah, if you do not have any questions of how is this going to go, because I'm simply going to go through my slides, explain a little bit about rules, the basic structure of debates, and finally speaker roles, and then we're gonna have some time for questions. So yeah, I think we can start, unless anybody wants to add anything. Okay. So here we go. Today we're going to be talking about basic debating rules that you have to know in order to grasp what debates are and what each individual speaker are going to be doing in debates, right? So firstly, with starting really basic things about what debates are and how they function. So there are mainly two teams in debate. They consist of three people, and one team always proposes the motion or the topic that is given, right? And the other team opposes it. However, that can be up to 5 overall team members, but only 3 can be debating at a time, right? And each debater gives one speech, and speeches are usually 8 minutes long in all tournaments, but in the upcoming novices tournament, we have them at 6 minutes long. Yeah. So there's a very simple way to look at debates. If you're just starting out, is just always remember that proposition is proposing a resolution to a problem and has the burden to prove why that resolution should be adopted, why it's going to work, and so on. An opposition always has the burden to demonstrate that no proposition did not meet that burden, their burden that they do not explain sufficiently enough that that resolution should be adapted. Right? So that is like a very simple breakdown of what debates essentially are. We sometimes call them, a structured argument, because essentially what you want to do in debates is to prove that your opponent is wrong, right? But there are simply like some rules that you have to adhere to in order to achieve that. Okay, so now let's get into what debates really look like, right? So there are two types of debates. There are impromptu debates and prepared debates. What does it mean is that impromptu debates, you get a motion, you get a topic of the debate 60 minutes prior to the debate itself. And for prepared motions, you usually get it at least a few weeks before you have to debate it, right? So usually if you're attending a tournament, as you will probably, hopefully, will be attending novices tournament, right? You will normally have like one prepared motion, and then the other debates will be impromptu debates. So in order to have a good debate, to have a substantial debates require engagement between teams. So this is done through multiple ways. Firstly, through refuting your opponent's arguments, but also through raising questions that we call points of information. There's also this thing called weighing, another debate strategies that we're going to be talking about in later sessions. But just so you know, at the very core structure of debates, you should always be engaging with your opponents. So for, POIs, for the questions that you're going to raise to another team, there's always a protected time. So the first and last minutes of somebody's speech, nobody can raise POIs, right? The speaker has simply time to speak for themselves, to introduce the debate, to close the debate. And during this time, you cannot raise any POIs. Some additional rules is that there should be at least 15 seconds between each POI that is raised, and each POI should not take up more than 15 seconds to ask, right? So you do not take up too much of somebody's times. And just some mention that you'll probably get accustomed in your debate club, or maybe when you are attending a tournament, is that all debates follow the equity conduct, right? So essentially, we're all respectful here. Although this is a structured argument, we're not trying to degrade somebody. So always be mindful and be respectful. Okay, so now into the real stuff. We're going to be talking about speaker roles and essentially what each debater is going to do in a debate, right? So we have team proposition, we have team opposition, and as you can see in the simple diagram, right, is that the first proposition starts the debate, and then comes the first opposition that essentially refutes what the first prop said. Then we have a second proposition which refutes what the first opposition said, and so on. And the debate is finished by the third opposition speaker. Okay, so for first proposition speakers, right? What is important for you? Oh, sorry. What is important for you to know? It's firstly that what you have to do essentially is you have to introduce the debate, right? What does this look like? Firstly, you have to introduce the status quo, or in more simple words, you simply have to describe how the world looks like right now and why is it bad, right? You come up as a first proposition speaker and you tell the judge that the world is burning down because some resolution has not been implemented. This is of course an extreme example, but this is essentially what status quo means. This is like the first words, the first sentences that you have in your debate. Then your duty is also to introduce definitions. Definitions we're going to talk about a bit later in the next slide, but essentially what they are is if you see any word that you think could be like a point of contention, right? Something that you disagree on with the other team, you have to define it to prove to the judge that what you believe in is the right definition. Then again, you have to have frame or plus model or model. What these things are is that you simply set the grounds of how things are going to work on in your world, right? If you're proposing a resolution, you have to explain to the judge not only that it's a good resolution, right, but it's actually going to work and how you're going to make it work. So, for example, in a motion, this House would ban tobacco, right? You have to explain how this ban is going to work, right? Do you ban all tobacco in stores, right? You also prosecute people who are caught smoking tobacco, right? This is like simple questions that you answer specifically in your model or in your framing. Then, as a first proposition speaker, you have to move on to our substantive material. So what is it, right, and how does it look like? Essentially, substantive material means the things that you bring to the debate that are exclusive to your side, or simply put, just arguments that you're going to present to the judge. So how does this look like is firstly, you outline all the arguments that your team will present, and you tell the judge, look, I'm going to present the first two arguments. My second speaker is going to present the third argument. This is just giving some basic structure to the judge, so it's easier for them to flow the debate and later decide who won. And usually first proposition speakers provide two arguments from their side. And lastly, they move on to outro, which is simply summarizing their speech in a quick sentence or so. Okay, so to delve a bit deeper into what first proposition material should be brought, especially about how you should introduce debate, right? So firstly, on framing and model. So let's just look at a very simple example, right? This house would allow corporal punishment for violent crimes. The first thing that could come to your mind is that you do not really understand what corporal punishment is. Usually, when you start debates, this will could be explained, to you by the people who set the motion. But for you to set the debate as well, for the judge to understand what you're talking about, you can also define it in your own terms, right? So what does this look like then? You can answer these questions, and there are multitude of questions that you can answer. This is just a few examples, right? But who will deliver the punishment? This punishment. What is the punishment likely to be or look like? How severe it is, right? And lastly, what can the punishment be given for? What are the crimes? How do you define the violent crime? And so on and so on. There's like many ways of how you can approach framing. But it's essential to give you an idea that when you get a motion, you have to have these, like you need to have these questions so you can actually explain them to the judge. And then there's this thing called definitions. And I already touched upon that, but essentially, you just have to look at the motion and determine what do the important words in the motion mean, and are they specifically obvious? Is it easy for everyone to understand? Because you might be familiar with what corporal punishment is, but somebody else might not, right? So always have in mind that this is the first thing that you do as a first proposition speaker. Okay, then we're going to move on to the first opposition speakers and what are their roles. So again, you will have an introduction to the debate, but this time you're going to do it from opposition side. So you're going to try to reverse everything that proposition said and say that, in your world where you do not impose the resolution, you're going to be better off. So this again looks like having the status quo, but also having framing or counter model. Then you're going to move on to refutation, which is an essential part of every debate. What does this look like is simply challenging the definition if it is unfair, right? If you think that what first proposition brought, like the definition on the framing that they brought, you simply cannot debate on these terms, right? Because you think that the world doesn't look like that. You can challenge the definition and simply provide a new one. But there's also, you can refute the whole model that they brought. You can just simply prove to the judge that the world doesn't work like that, and proposition is never going to achieve that. And most importantly, your job is to refute the arguments, because that is the time, like the portion that first proposition speaker is going to spend the most time on, because this is their substantive material. So first opposition speaker then has the duty to refute these arguments and essentially prove why their mechanisms, why their impacts are untrue. Then after you are done with refutation, you're going to move on to your two own substantive materials or arguments. And lastly, again, outro. Okay, now we're gonna move to second speakers. And it is, in second speeches, at first you're probably going to follow like some basic structure that I have provided to you here. But in time, when you're debating, you're going to understand that second speakers have a lot of burdens on their shoulders, right? Because their functions involve a lot of things. Firstly, they have to continue the refutation of the opponent's case, right? If I am second opposition, and my first opposition speaker maybe refuted the arguments, right? But I believe that I can expand on that. I will have to do that. But also, you're going to have to refute the case that your opponents rebuilt. For example, the second proposition speaker came and rebuilt everything that the first opposition speaker refuted. For example, they provided, again, new examples, maybe new material of their arguments to the judge, and you believe that, oh, these arguments are against standing, I have to refute them. So this is like a big function that the second speakers have. So essentially, when how to know, how to do this is simply you have to ask the question why the opposing team's defense is wrong or not sufficient, and why our world is better off without it, right? Then you also have a function to rebuild your own case after the previous speaker refuted it. So, the first opposition speaker came and said that, oh, all your arguments are wrong, your framing doesn't work, your definitions are all wrong. So the function of the second proposition speaker will be then to rebuild all their case and prove to the judge again that your definition is the only right one. Your model actually works, and your arguments are sufficient enough to prove that you won and opposition didn't. And then lastly, all second speakers present a substantive argument, substantive material. Is usually not as extensive, not as intricate, and as in the first speeches, but you're still going to have a third argument. And how does the basic structure then look like? Is you're also going to have some intro, right? Maybe you're going to explain to the judge what you're going to tell in your speech. Then you will have case rebuild or refutation. When you move along with the base, you will see that these two things are integrated, and a lot of times when you're refuting something, you're also rebuilding your case or vice versa. You're going to have an argument and lastly an outro. So some tips and tricks for second speakers to understand better how to do these speeches, and how to excel at being a second speaker. So an important part of your second speech is to ensure that you are actively distinguishing yourself from your opponents. And this comes as a skill. You're going to learn how to do it through time, through practice. But few simple ideas that I'm going to give you is that you always have to compare and contrast between your material and the opposing team material. So what does this look like? Is that you have to explain how precisely you, your team, differ from your opponents. So maybe in terms of stakeholders or the people who are affected by the motion, maybe your strategy is better because you have arguments that affect more people or they affect them more deeply, right? Like this is related to impacts as well. So there are a lot of questions that you can prove to the judge that you're actually the one taking the win to home, right? Because you're comparing and contrasting between your material and the opponent's material. But another thing that is important to do is to contextualize, right? So even in cases where you're obviously different, it is important to explain why your material is important in the context of the round, right? You could have the best argument about, why tobacco is bad, but if you do not explain, essentially in the motion, why should we even care about why tobacco is bad, right? You're not contextualizing that information. So be sure that you'll always prove to the judge that what you're saying is relevant, that is different from your opponents, and that it impacts more people, that its impacts are bigger. Simply prove that you are the one who has the upper hand in the debate. And lastly, for third speakers, probably this is the speeches that are the hardest to define because all people have rather different strategies of how they approach them. But the general role of a whip or a third speaker is to summarize the debate in the manner that explains why your team won the debate. And the most common and usually most effective way to do that is to provide clash points. Clash points are essentially questions that the debate revolves around. So if you see that, there's some contention point between you and the opponents where you completely disagree, right? Maybe let's take a very simple example about the same tobacco, right? Your opponent saying that, it's really bad, it's really detrimental. You as an opposition saying it, oh, but it's not that bad, you can relax, I'm not saying that is a good thing, but I'm just simply providing you an example, right? Then you're going to have a clash point of whether tobacco is good. Another example would be simple to take, your opponent is saying that it's okay to limit your free choice to choose to smoke because the government is going to protect your health. An opposition similarly says that, oh no, we can never limit the free choice, right? Because it is inherent in our rights to have that choice. So these are the main clashes that could arise in this debate, right? And this is the main questions that you should address as a third speaker. Yeah. And then essentially how you're going to structure your speech definitely depends on you. But what it usually looks like is, again, you're going to have to have some intro. You're going to case rebuild because there are going to be things that are refuted by the second speakers and that might be essential to your case. So you want to bring them back and rebuild them and show them that actually they are the most important things, right? You're also going to refute if you're a proposition third speaker, because opposition third speakers cannot refute anything because nothing new is brought in by the third speakers, right? The very important point here is that third speakers can only summarize the debate, right? They cannot bring in new information. They cannot bring in a new substantive material. What they can do, right, is they can provide new examples or new ways to approach the argument, but there cannot be completely new information that has been not addressed before. So essentially, third opposition speakers do not really have anything to refute, only the third proposition speakers. Then you're probably going to move on to your clash points and have an outro. So in clash points, what is also really important and happens a lot to debaters is that you're probably not going to have separate points of oh, this is my case rebuild, this is my refutation, and these are the clash points. There are a lot of times where you can actually integrate the rebuild and the refutation into your clash points and have this big summarization of the debate that makes it really clear for the judge to judge, essentially. And then to dwell with it a little bit deeper into the clashes themselves and how to effectively do them, right? How to distinguish them. So you need to try and establish what the most important arguments and factors in a given round are, right? So if you need to find that question of contention, that point that you disagreed fundamentally with the other team on, you have to consider what you brought in the debate and what the other team brought, right? So we're going to think about what are the most important things we have said and what are the most important things opposition has said. To do that, to be able to distinguish these things, you have to, as a third speaker, always flow the debate, right? You have to note, this is what the proposition said, this is what we as opposition said. And then it is really easy to just simply on your paper to mark where your arguments, where your refutation points essentially clashed, how they're related. So many times you can have a good idea of what potential questions might be going into a round, but you should always be flexible and not preset questions too early in case an opposing team thinks of something you did not, right? So I have this example of this house with banned tobacco again, and we have talked about it again previously. So it can be pretty clear, what the clashes could be about. But always be aware that your opponents could think up of something that you did not, right? So do not have your third speech written down before the debate even starts, because that is simply not efficient. And a lot of times when you do that, the debate revolves around something completely else, and then you cannot win the debate because you did not find the most important clashes, the most important questions. So the simple questions that you could ask yourself to try and find the clashes is, do individuals have a right to use tobacco? Will banning tobacco help current smokers, right? Oh, sorry. No. And so on, right? There are a lot of questions that you can simply think of before the debate starts with your team, and then you will see that probably at least some of them will arise in the debate and could be potential clashes. Okay, and last we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for third speakers. So firstly, talking about refutation. So like I mentioned before, it could be simply included in one of your questions and flagged, or questions meaning clash points, right? Or presented at the beginning of your speech. You just look at the strategy, look at the debate, and decide which is more comfortable for you, which you think will be more easy to understand for the judge. Third speakers also should use an extra sheet of paper to track the POIs as well as the arguments and everything essentially debate, right? To simply know what's going on. And especially with POIs, why I mentioned this here is that a lot of times with POIs, you can catch the flaws in the opposing team's case, right? And then if you see that they did not answer the POI sufficiently, you can integrate that into your clash points and prove, look, judge, we raised this question, they weren't able to answer it sufficiently enough. We think that this question is really important, this debate, so on and so on. Therefore, we win, right? So this is like some tip for you. And then usually at least 2 clashes are apparent after first speeches. Because if you are the first opposition speaker, you know what proposition speaker brought because you just listened to them, and you know what you have in your own case. Now, what's going to happen is that you'll already see which arguments are clashing together. You see which material is opposing each other. So once established as headings on the whip speaker's notes, we just write down that, oh, this is the heading, the title for the argument that proposition or opposition used. Then you can put relevant arguments underneath them along with refutation, and just like put your clash point like that. And then a really important thing for third speakers is to prove to the judge that you're not bringing new information, or that something has been sufficiently explained throughout the whole bench, throughout the whole, 2 other speeches that you already had from your team. It is really advisable for you to highlight your partner's comments, right? So just prove to the judge, that our first speaker already said this, our second speaker repeated it, And then team opposition completely neglected the statement. They never refuted it, right? And I'm bringing this again and I'm explaining it more. So just be aware that it's really beneficial for the judges to hear you say that, you flagged something, you showed that it was like continuously brought throughout the bench. Okay. So that is all I have for you on like substantive material, right? The new word that we learned today. And now we can move on to